good morning, respectively, good afternoon and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the second of 3 webinars hosted by the Swiss Re Institute, by IBM Research and by the Gottlieb Duttweiler Institute. And welcome back to this lovely studio at Swiss Re Center for Global Dialogue. At Rüschlikon, Switzerland, a studio which is, and by the way, and this is mainly an information for the audience residing in Switzerland and having seen the newscast last Friday evening on Swiss TV, a studio which is being operated by real camera people and not by computers and robot cameras. We had a little hiccup there, nothing to write home about, only the tabloid press was writing about it. But never mind, we are here today to have a very close look on quantification, keeping score in a metric society. And for the members of our esteemed audience watching from the US or the UK or any other area which has not a metric but the imperial measurement system, well, is being applied, no reason to switch off your computer. We are all in this together because it's about data. Data. Our data, literally about every move we make, every breath we take, every acquisition you make online, every look you have into your smartphone, every Uber driver who is rating you, and every restaurant you yourself are rating. Virtually every aspect of our lives, starting at the very beginning of our lives, minutes after our first breath. We are being measured, size and weight. And almost from then on, the quantification of human beings in the 21st century indeed never ever stops. Never ever. May it be self-quantification or our data being collected by a myriad of collectors, from governments to retailers, from insurances and the finance industry to public transport, from education to employers. We are being measured constantly using data from a ballooning range of sources, measured and evaluated. We're getting scores from algorithms we don't even know of. The dating app Tinder, for example, has a secret ELO score which is deciding who is attractive and which is influencing the matching as well. But hey, at least you can always blame the algorithm and not your looks. But jokes aside, all this is having an enormous impact on society. When everything is quantified, power accrues to whoever is keeping score. About all this, we need to talk, and we will be doing that with Professor Steffen Mau from Humboldt University of Berlin, an eminent professor of macro-sociology. He is working the fields of comparative welfare research, social inequality, further on European integration, migration and digitization. He is a Mercator Fellow. He was a visiting fellow at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University, and he is a member of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. And he is the author of an intriguingly interesting book, The Metric Society on the Quantification of the Social. The Financial Times says about the book, Professor Mau dwells on the pitfalls of metric society. The Economist says Mr. Mau's book is a wide-ranging tour through rankings and ratings, stars and points, charts and graphs. The German weekly Die Zeit says Steffen Mau dissects in his book the madness of data collection and evaluation. I am confident you are joining me in thinking Professor Mau is the right man in the right place here today with us. And we are being joined by Dr. Jakub Samochowiec, senior researcher at the Gottlieb Duttweiler Institute, where the social psychologist analyzes social, economical and technological changes with a focus on decision, old age and consumption. His lecture topics include the future of civil society, participation and volunteering, or, for example, planning tomorrow, how we think about the future and the errors we commit in doing so, and last but not least, for example, nudging, how we make decisions and how we are influenced by our environment. Jakub indeed says, quantification ratings and other control mechanisms can be seen as crutches which aren't necessary if we would trust each other as much as we would deserve to be trusted. Again, the right scholar in the right place at the right time, I dare say, here today with us. Welcome to the both of you. Many thanks for joining us. And before we get started in earnest, as with our first webinar, there will be an extended Q&A after our two experts had the floor. You know the drill and you know how to send the questions, your questions. Just keep them coming like you did last time. This is all for you. Steffen and Jakub are looking forward to a true barrage of questions of yours. And again, we also have questions for you. Yes, you will be quantified as well. No self-respecting webinar about quantification would go without. So you should be seeing now a QR code. Just take a picture of it, which then will take you to our three utterly indiscreet questions. Number one of the questions being, do you usually check the online ratings before going to a restaurant you don't know? Almost always, sometimes, or almost never. Second question being, would you share real-time health data with your insurance company wearing a device of some sorts in return for reduced fees? Would you do that? No, or would it depend your decision to use a device like this on the amount of the reduction? And question number three, can your productivity at work be quantified in a reliable way? Yes, pretty well, maybe a little, or not really. The results of our little data collection will find their way into the Q&A later on. You will see. But now, ladies and gentlemen, I leave the camera to Steffen Mau on keeping score on a metric society. Please, Professor.
So I'm starting sharing my screen here. Hope it works. Okay, I have a little presentation for you, trying to put my own view on the quantified society into perspective. And of course, the most pertinent, maybe even infamous example of quantification is, of course, a spectacular and maybe even revolutionary plan of the Chinese government to install a so-called social credit system containing plenty of different data coming from different areas of life, be it consumption, public behavior, driving behavior, even reviews of employers or teachers, all will be condensed into one single score. This is at least the theory and the announcement of the Chinese government. And we now see many different pilots at different places and regions in China developing around that kind of understanding. And my take here, and I was asked to talk a little bit about the relationship between quantification and trust. And if you look at that example, then you immediately understand, here's a picture of that, you immediately understand how trust comes into the picture, because a self-declared aim of the project is to create an environment of trust or to facilitate a mentality of honesty. So the purpose is, the long-term purpose is to install and instigate more and more trust in societies, and hereby means of total social control. Of course, this is a very sinister and maybe even infamous example, but it illustrates a general trend towards quantification, which I call quantification cult, with a number of drivers. And the first one is, of course, economization that has started already in the 80s, also with the paradigm of neoliberalism, where measurability, efficiency issues, accountability issues moved up the agenda. But it's also related to the very process of digitization. So the sheer availability of numbers, possibilities, growing possibility to manage big data, and also, of course, forms of algorithmic classification come into mind. And if you look around where quantification takes place, and you see many different instances and examples of that, ratings, rankings, scores, be it in the area of health, or if you apply for a visa, self-quantification, so wearing badges or Fitbit wearables, systems of indicators to describe everything, universities, public institutions, hospitals, so everything can be measured, evaluated. And I interpret data as new forms of symbols of distinctions. They do not represent the world, say, as it is outside, but they are basically create a world in their own. Or numbers, in my understandings, create orders of worth. Because what do numbers do? If you have a number for a phenomenon, for a person, for a specific characteristic, you can easily distinguish between more or less, or between better or worse. So it's also a process of valuation. And valuation is not meant in a way to determine a specific value. It is meant more sociological understanding, endowing something with value. It's about establishment. And of course, if you think about measurements or quantifications, then you immediately enter the world of evaluation and also of comparison. So numbers can travel, so you can decontextualize information and bring it into other contexts, and you can easily compare things which are at first hand maybe incomparable. And numbers at the same time, they have a certain kind of competitive bias, how one could call that. So they need people to compete with others, because then once you compare, you try to get better, or money is, or attention is distributed according to certain numbers and figures. So the area where you can find that, I mean, you all know that from your everyday life. You have now smart fitness studios, smart homes, smart working places. It's ever increasing, and numbers are quite telling. So estimates say that in 2025 we will have around 5,000 interactions with mobile devices. Recently, I read that someone counted the sheer number of information that is stored via digitization, and says, so now in 2 days, we store as much information as the whole human history till the year 2007. So there's enormous increase in terms of availability of matrix data in numbers. Relating that to the issue of trust, is not so easy, and there's no clear-cut relationship. Most of the research on trust sees trust as a favorable expectation regarding others people's actions and intentions. So this is generalized trust. Trust a stranger once you interact. And there are certain functional properties. Why is trust good in society? It facilitates cooperation. It's a basis for risk-taking behavior, and it also reduces complexity. Georg Simmel, one of the founding fathers of modern sociology, sees trust as the most synthetic forces in society, function of a hypothesis certain enough to serve as a basis for practical conduct. So in some way, trust can be seen as a weak form of knowledge. You are not completely blind to what reality says to you, but it's not a situation where you know exactly what is going on. So it's somehow in between, a hybrid between knowing and not knowing. I will discuss 3 theses how quantification relates to trust. In first understanding, you could say quantification is trust production. This is a Chinese model, so it can create trust where there is a lack of trust. Second is quantification can also be seen as a substitute to trust, because it's a new form of societal control and maybe replaces trust, but it can also undermine trust. And I will give you examples for each of these understandings. The first one is an example that I myself experienced when I was in the US and we were searching for a babysitter, and there was a website. It's now not online anymore. It was called mylife.com, where you simply type in a name of a person and the zip code, and this system analyzed available data, online data, registered data, so many different data sources, and produced a so-called reputation score. And on the website it was said, reputation is more important than credit. Only MyLife provides reputation scores based on public information gathered from government, social, and other sources, plus personal reviews by others. So what they do, they look through crime registers, public internet, also the darknet, all social media profiles. They establish names, family names, mortgages, everything what you can find in the internet. And in the end, you get a rating number between 0 and 5. You see that here there's a person with a score of 3.77. And of course, the users, they wrote excellent endorsements of that kind of tool. Lucia said, you'd be crazy to rent someone an apartment not looking at the reputation score first. Or Ricardo said, I declined a job offer after I did a reputation check on the guy who was going to be my supervisor. Larry is even better. So he says, I felt a lot better about my daughter's new boyfriend after I ran a reputation check. So the availability of these data obviously can instigate trust. And also in the case we were using that for searching for a babysitter, it seems to be something that is helpful to build up trust relationships. But at the same time, you could say, yeah, it's a trust substitute. So we are not dealing with proper trust, we deal with something else. We deal with forms of social control. And we have also many examples of that on the work floor with Amazon or firms like Zalando. Most of them, they have specific rating system where not only supervisors rate employees, but also employees rate each other. So the relationship of evaluation and rating becomes bi-directional. And also at consumer markets, here I have an example of Airbnb on the slide. You can see that there's a very strong signal value of rating marks. Most of these kind of markets would probably not exist without specific types of rating system, because you have very volatile markets, you have casual traders, people do not know each other, so it's probably very risky, for example, to offer your home to someone else coming to a city, not having any kind of information. So the customer will get a rating and will have a rating history, but also the person offering the service has a rating evaluation. And in that way, of course, a specific type of relationship is constructed with also a strong disciplining aspect. Third is in governance by indicators. Also here we have a strong bias towards surveillance, monitoring, and forms of remote control. If you work in a delivery service, so your supervisor knows always where you are, knows the speed and the frequency you have interactions with potential customers. You can also delegate control to customers, for example, asking them to give a rating to a taxi driver or someone else. So here trust is not maybe the proper description of what is happening, but we have a number of trust substitutes. Third is that quantification can undermine trust in terms of a loss of professional control. Here I have a picture of a website for rating doctors. Normally, professionalization is understood as a form of self-organization with specific logics and actions and standards, where the occupation control themselves and live up to specific standards. If you have these kind of rating systems from clients or patients, then of course the form of trust that is generated is somehow different. It is consumer generated, it is mass based, so a lot of people give evaluation. And some professions, in particular doctors, they claim that the trust relationship that is part of the professional ethos will be undermined in the long run, because when people evaluate doctors, they probably associate or different aspects than the proper professional evaluation would do. We also have trust an asymmetric relationship in many areas where big business is basically organizing evaluation, and we have a strong power of algorithms which might undermine trust, because you have a lot of information and forms of classification based on algorithms. People do not need to trust each other anymore. To sum up, my thesis would be that everything that can be measured will be measured, and this is something we can basically observe every day, and be it social life, networks, personal activities, consumer behavior, health, and sports. And digitization is creating a kind of new social panopticon. And I would claim here that the tyranny of light that is part and parcel of the process of quantification does not need trust in itself, because trust is the absence of control, and quantification in its very essence is always related to control and surveillance. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed, Steffen. I was informed that, sadly so, obviously the sound quality was far from being perfect. Our apologies for that. I understand that the system had to be restarted while Steffen's keynote. Again, huge apologies for that. But to let you know that, the recording, which will be put online on the event website later today, there you will have perfect sound, no restart of the system, so you always can go back there if you missed a part you thought would be very interesting to follow on screen. So again, apologies for that. We do hope that the little technical glitches we were encountering are not deterring you from sending in questions for this truly, utterly interesting topic. So, many thanks, Steffen, for your keynote. You cannot hear the applause. I'm sure it was still there, even in spite of the sound problems, just virtual. I'm still hoping there are questions coming in. Indeed, we do. And now to Jakub Samochowiec, arguing that as a society, we systematically underestimate the trustworthiness of others, and wondering what part quantification is playing in this. Jakub, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. As we have seen, quantification can have very diverse effects on trust. On one hand, it can improve trust, it can also undermine it. I think one other important aspect is that just by controlling, you imply that control is needed. So, for example, there's also a study with, there was one interesting study which measured how trusting people are who receive governmental support, and those people who receive means-tested governmental support, so those who are scrutinized, whether do you really deserve to get that money, in the end, they end up to trust other people less than those who receive generalized governmental support. So just, you received you have a child and you get money for that, and you don't have to check to prove that you actually are deserving of that. And so because the reason is that those people who are scrutinized, they feel like, okay, probably it's necessary to scrutinize people as many people cheat. And so I think this is another way how a quantification might also undermine trust, just the control aspect of it. And so, but I want to look at trust in general now, on a societal level. So, and I want to ask two questions. So on one hand, how much do we actually trust each other? And the other question is, how much could we trust each other? And I believe that there is discrepancy there, so we underestimate how much we can trust each other. And this is also kind of understandable when you consider that if you don't trust people enough, you don't notice that you could have trusted them more. Whereas if you trust too much, you notice rather faster than maybe that was too much trust I put in that other person. And I want to specify, to focus on Switzerland here, because I think Switzerland has like a pretty special situation, and I want to show several data about that. So it's also kind of ironic that I show numbers, why we shouldn't rely too much on numbers here. But I think that also shows also the complicated situation we are in. So why is Switzerland special? We at the Gottlieb Duttweiler Institute, we co-financed a study at the University of Zurich by Michel Marchal and his colleagues. And what they did was, basically, they lost wallets. They lost plenty of wallets all over the world. And so their confederates lost wallets. They went to banks, post office, and so on, and said, hey, look, I found this wallet, but I have to go now, bye. And so what Michel Marchal and his colleagues measured was how many of those people, the presumable owners of those wallets, were contacted afterwards. And it turns out if you want to lose your wallet, you should probably do that in Switzerland. And what we also find here is, interestingly, what many people also expected otherwise is that if there's money inside of those wallets, more people are being contacted. So those people who don't contact the owners of the wallets, they are not thieves. There's not people who just like say, okay, I keep that money. It's probably more the case that they just don't bother too much. They think like, whatever, maybe I'll do that later. They put it aside and they don't contact people anymore. So it seems that Switzerland and the Nordic countries especially are great places to lose money, or to lose wallets at least. And interestingly, we talked about China before. Here, China seems to be the worst place to do so. There's some talk, some discussion about the methodology, if this fits, but I think it's interesting, and it also fits some data. There's like conflicting data about that, but some data of Chinese sociologists who also talk about a trust crisis they have. And so one could also see that maybe such a thing like a social credit score makes more sense, or in such a culture, or at least that might be a reason why, for example, we are rather creeped out by such a system, whereas Chinese people seem not to be bothered that much as we are, because that's also a cultural difference there, and at least in some way, maybe if this data is to be trusted, that there's like more of a social capital, of a civic society, a feeling of which is already here in Switzerland and which does not have to be substituted by a technology or a quantification, a form of control. And so I want to dig a little bit deeper into Switzerland with another study that was done in Zurich. And what those Falk and Zehnder did was they played a trust game with plenty of people in Zurich. The trust game works like this. There's two players always who don't know each other. So let's say it's me and Florian. I am the first mover. I get like 20 francs. And then I can keep all those 20 francs, or I could give them to Florian. By doing so, or I can give 10 francs or how much I want. By doing so, this money is tripled. So if I give him all the 20, Florian gets 60 francs, and then Florian can decide whether he wants to give me something back or not. So because we don't know each other, there's no consequences for him to keep everything. But it shows that, okay, by working together, like this is a metaphor for working together, we can improve wealth, but we have to trust each other. So I have to trust him to give me something back, or else we don't multiply the wealth. And so Zehnder and Falk, they did this study in Zurich where they asked people, okay, how much do you want to give to people from other districts, city districts? And what we see here is how much those people gave on investment between 0 and 20 francs. And the gray bars are how much they expect to get back from the other player, whereas the black bars is how much they actually received back. So here again, we see that people systematically underestimate how much they receive back from these other players. And interestingly, there was less of an underestimation and more of accurate judgment when it got to people who lived in the same city districts as they themselves. So it might be that just with more experience, this negative cliché we have of each other is being overridden. Another point of evidence which shows in that direction is a study we did ourselves very recently. What we did is, with the start of the corona pandemic in Switzerland, we asked readers of the Tagesanzeiger, a newspaper in Switzerland, how much they trust people in general with handling the pandemic, and whether they consider Swiss people in general to be more egoistic or more showing more solidarity. What we find is that in the very beginning of the pandemic, March 20th, most people actually do not trust other Swiss people too much. Like over 60% say, I rather not trust Swiss people with handling the pandemic. Also, there's like a 50-50 distribution about whether they consider other people to show solidarity or being egoistic. But only 2 weeks later, with more experiences, with learning about cases of solidary behavior of young people bringing food, or shopping to older people and so on, we have more experience, direct experiences, which again overrides our cliché we have of other people. And another evidence for this interpretation is that we also ask people about whether they trust their own neighbors in handling the pandemic, and it turns out that they actually trusted their neighbors from the beginning on much more, because also there again, they have more experience with those people, and they don't have this negative cliché, which is being overridden by experience. Another example we experienced this is the home office, where before, partly because of a mistrust, people were not permitted to do as much home office as they wanted. Now they were forced to, and it turns out it worked actually quite well. People not only reported to be more productive, but also we find that people did more work in less time. What is the takeaway message here? On one hand, I think it's important that we trust less than we could. The more experience we have with other people, the more we override those negative cliches and we start to trust more. Especially in societies with a lot of trust, with a lot of social capital, we have to be very wary about importing control measures from other places, like China or maybe even the US, where where we have some Silicon Valley products which measure the keystrokes of workers or take photos of people working and so on. So because those measures, they could actually undermine the trust, and in the end, in a lot of ways, or in a lot of cases, trust is actually more efficient also than controlling people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jakub. Many thanks indeed for your insight. As far as I can see, there still might be a problem with the sound. Any feedback, as Andreas Obrist from Swiss Re is writing in the chat, would be highly appreciated. I don't know whether he got any feedback so far. He did, and it looks good. We do have sound again. Well, what a relief. TV without sound is like, well, I think it's even worse than radio without sound. There we go. We could use the flag alphabet, like with Monty Python. I love you, Heathcliff, Wuthering Heights. Well, no, we don't need to do that. The sound is back on. Jolly good news. So, we hope if the sound is right, you will still be in a position and find yourself able to send in some questions. There are none so far in, understandably so. But if you find it in your heart or in your interest, in your curiosity to send a question in, keep it coming. So let's not forget the 3 questions we put to you right at the beginning of this webinar. Maybe the gallery can put on the QR code again. Once more, we will be coming back to these 3 questions to which you get by taking a picture of the QR code during our discussion. So let's see what we have in terms of questions from the audience. None whatsoever, but we're in Switzerland, we are being prepared always, and I prepared some questions. I've got a very general question to Steffen in Berlin. Steffen, I'm wondering, after what you said, after your keynote, I had this impression, well, basically, it's all Big Brother. Either we are Big Brother, the members of the great European, American, global public, we are being brother watching others, or we are being watched. So basically, it's a one game of a very big brother. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I always shy away from very bold statements in terms of everything gets worse, and you have to be hypercritical of everything what happens at that front. Because, of course, you can also see quantification, think about self-quantification, so the self-measurement of sports, activities, or health as a form of emancipation. So people call that self-knowledge through numbers. And that could be something good because you don't sit at home, drink a beer and watch television. You might take your sports dress and make some exercise instead. And that is, of course, good. But you always have the situation that these data are collected by a third party. Maybe they are exploited. You can become classified. There are big data brokers on the market who sell and resell your data and maybe compile them together with other data. And there the problem for me starts. Because then these data, you encounter them at a very different place. Just think about, for example, credit scores. So they are designed for a very specific area. It's a financial tool that makes a lot of sense to estimate the likelihood of repaying a debt. But this instrument, of course, has now become, or basically it diffused into many different areas. In the US, without a credit score, you might have difficulties to rent a flat or a car. The Chinese credit score can even be used, for example, to apply for a visa for Canada. So there are now forms of colonization where these kinds of numbers become actually important in very different areas of life. So half of the employers in the US, they check the credit score before they hire a person. And I think this is where the problem basically starts. And related to that is what you mentioned as Big Brother, and I call that an asymmetrical form of transparency, is that we become more and more readable. So we become more and more quantified, but we do not really know what the quantifiers do. So why do they use which type of algorithms? Here you have very little opportunity to react to that, to look into that. So they very often say, yeah, we simply do it and it's a business secret. We don't have to make that public. But I would say, given that these scores and metrics become very important for offering people life chances or declining life chances, I think they need to become more democratized. So we have to have more involvement into the business of monitoring and quantifying more than we are involved right now.
Saying we don't need only transparency concerning us, but also transparency concerning the people who are quantifying and interpreting us. Jakub, I've got a question for you. Basically, Steffen is saying that the voluntary handing over of personal data is enforcing the right behavior as it is pushing back the wrong behavior. Is this sheer economic, behavioral economics, and where is trust coming in there? That's a tough one, I'm sorry.
I'm confident I can handle this.
Oh, I am, because I do know Gottlieb Duttweiler Institute is very much also into behavioral economics, so shoot.
I think that, it is the case that it might enforce like good behavior, however this is defined. But the thing is, what you always also have to consider is that those measurements, they are never perfect. It's always just, those measurements, it's always just, you try to get to measure something which is not the right thing, but it's just like an approximation to it. And the problem there is that people would then start to optimize this approximation. So for example, I read this one article where, for example, the person who worked at a call center, the calls is being always monitored by a machine, the person just found out that to be considered more friendly and therefore get more money, I think, they just have to say the word sorry all the time. And totally confusing the person they are talking with, but it just worked that they do so, and which shows that this, once you try to quantify it, you always lose something. Or another example is a friend of mine who worked at an electronics retailer, and there they had a course how to smile. So they had this person who came over to show them how to smile, and he managed to follow those instructions perfectly and produce such a creepy smile, which is really shuddering by just watching at it. And I think that's quite, that's something that happens a lot. Or let's say Amazon drivers who happen to have car accidents and so on, because that's just an externality which is not being measured. And so I think it's dangerous to say it optimizes this behavior because you always lose something.
And because there is also a bias of the people who monitor and who decide what's going to be monitored and going to evaluate the results, bias seems to be, could be a problem?
Yeah, totally. I mean, this bias might also, again, come out of trust, but maybe also out of mistrust, or maybe it's also kind of a relic out of an industrial society where you had to check in and out at the machine before you go into the factory and so. And this is being taken over now. We measure the time we work and so, whereas we will see if people, for example, consider that their work is somehow related to the amount of time they spend there.
As we just heard earlier on from Steffen in Berlin, that basically China, with its so-called social credit system, Steffen, is almost, well, I call it now, taking it to the extreme. I trust you have a prognosis, talking about trust, that something like this could be established in Western society as well, or what's your outlook? What's your forecast?
Yeah, it's very difficult to say. I mean, I said at the very end that everything what can be measured will be measured to some extent. I do not have a Chinese vision for the rest of the world, but I see that there are many different other countries. Think of Russia or even Venezuela and other countries. They are quite interested in the Chinese model because it allows to keep the population under control, and it allows to detect basically also not conformative or non-conformative behavior. And in that way, of course, it can be a very strong instrument of repression. So in most Western societies, we have market classifications. So where it's basically interesting for firms to tease out your market value. And there are these famous examples where companies estimate a so-called customer value lifetime score, so they know exactly what kind of profit a specific customer may bring. And in the future, you can imagine that you have systems where you basically call for a service, you call a firm, and this firm knows exactly from the number who's calling and knows your market value. And the length of waiting for someone answering the call may very well depend on the score you actually have. And this might change, of course, the relationship between firms and customers, making some more interesting and valuable and others not. Just a small remark to what Jakub said. I think this is a very important point he mentioned, that most of the measurements we use are not identical with the objectives they relate to. There's always a small or tiny gap. Sometimes the gap is bigger, sometimes it's smaller. But in general terms, we have a form of measurement that is never perfect. And if measurements lead to specific reaction, then of course people react to the measurement, not to the objective that is related to the measurement. And there's a very famous example by an author called Campbell, and he made that or give an example of the Vietnam War, where they changed the counting system for dead enemies. And then it depends very much. So in a guerrilla war, it's not so easy to identify whether the enemy is a soldier or a civilian. And he found out that at that time, so this kind of vagueness in the definition made some military units of the US more likely to kill also civilians, because they counted in a positive way to the performance of that military unit. This is a very extreme example, I know, but you can find that in many areas of life where you really have a gap between what is being measured and what the actually objective of that measurement relates to.
Just a quick afterthought, Steffen, having listened to you right now. And a quick answer, please, as well. Do you think it's basically good news for society, also in terms of trust, that measurements are never quite perfect, that there is this gap? Is this good or bad news for a society?
It's very difficult to make a general claim on that. I also think so it can be very good to measure things and to get more visibility and to make things transparent, but there can be also a tyranny of transparency. So if everything is being measured, then of course you don't need trust anymore, because you have complete control and surveillance, and that would be a society we do not want to live in.
Tyranny of transparency, that's a new one. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here first. Let's come to the polling question we put to you earlier in this webinar. Maybe the gallery can give us the slide, the results. I think there they are. We ask you, do you usually check the online ratings before going into a restaurant you don't know? The sample is not too big, I understand, but nevertheless, 45% say almost always, 45% say sometimes, and only 9% say almost never. Jakub, what do you make of this? People are curious. People want to check. People want to be sure. What does this tell you?
Well, to be honest, I'm actually almost a bit surprised that there's so many people who only do it sometimes.
You do it all the time?
Yeah, I actually do it a lot, yeah. And so it's always what, yeah, it shows that not everybody's like me.
No, but you obviously expect it. Again, the little caveat, the sample is not too great. Not too big. Why are you surprised? Why were you expecting more people to almost always check beforehand?
I just thought the thing is, it's just so easy. I think that's also quite another aspect, that the convenience of those digital tools, they're so nice. So it's so easy to do things that you don't think about it anymore. And so therefore, I would have imagined that more people do it, but it would be interesting to see if there's, for example, an age difference. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, also things like concern with privacy or so is something that is correlated with age. So younger people seem to be, or there's some study in Switzerland at least also. I seem to mention a lot of Swiss studies now.
You did. Let me come back to the sample, because it's actually, there's a relation to what you just said. I mean, the sample here is not too large, we see it, and maybe the rating of a restaurant you want to go to, and the rating is not very good. But if you have a look into how big is the sample, and you see maybe it's only 5 people who have rated this restaurant, and one person of these 5 had a terrible experience, I don't know, by mistake, something terrible happened, I don't know, soup being poured over your head by a waiter's mistake. Blimey, it can happen, but of course he gives a score of 1 of actually 5 stars possible. This is tearing down the whole rating in general. I mean, this is bad news, and is this reliable? Can we trust a rating like this if the sample is too small? I don't think people would be actually looking into how big is the sample, or am I mistaken?
I don't know about studies like this, but I could imagine that people also actually consider this when they see just like 3 or 4 ratings. Maybe even that's something that the raters themselves, they consider. That sometimes I think they show those results only after a certain amount of ratings that have come in.
I think Steffen would like to comment. At least out of the corner of my eye, I saw you looking like you wanted to contribute. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you have a situation where people also look at quantities, and if you have many ratings, I mean, think about eBay or others, they make that also visible. So how many users basically rated a certain product or a seller, and then you get badges, or you get additional stars or different colors. So it's a very hierarchical system. And if you have tens of thousands, then of course you are a top seller. The interesting fact here is of course that the whole rating, all the business is organized quite hierarchical. Think about restaurant ratings. Then of course you only look at the top 10. So the first page is important. So you need at least a 4.8 or 4.9 or a 5 to appear there. And all else, so people who have just a 3.7, they are not part of the game anymore, because no one looks at them. And that is very interesting, because you have really a concentration of attention, of customer attention on the top. So it's a winner takes all market there. And restaurants, they have to make a big effort. I don't know whether you ever experienced it. You say, so I have no cash, I cannot give you any tip. And they said, no, I don't need tip. It's better to give me a good rating. So they really long for good ratings. It's quite crucial to survive in the market.
Well, that's the boss of the restaurant. Don't ask the service personnel about that. Let's come to health data. Health data, a very sensitive topic, of course. But we asked, indeed, is the incentive right? Is the amount of the reduction you might receive if you use a device which is recording and giving away your real-time personal health data? Our polling question has been, would you share real-time health data with your insurance company for reduced fees? Again, with a rather small sample, but an interesting result. 50-50 right away. 50-50. Jakub, what do you make of that? Surprised? Is that mirroring results of similar studies you made?
Well, I'm actually a bit surprised that there's so many who say they would do so, because also an important thing is there's a distinction between what you say and what you do. So a lot of people say, yeah, privacy is very important. And for example, now we have this topic with the Corona app, where a lot of people say, oh no, I don't want to have this. But on the other hand, they do have a WhatsApp installed or a Facebook app and so on. And so I am not surprised by the numbers if they were like in the real world happening, but I'm surprised that people actually say so that they would do.
Indeed. We have audience questions. Hurrah! And I'll give them right away to our 2 experts. We have a question saying, would scoring people increase trust in each others? Again, would scoring people increase trust in each others? How would you measure the success of such a system? In effect, the Swiss Constitution says that one should look at the weakest to judge the success of society. I put this to Steffen, if you don't mind. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I'm a little bit ambivalent. So it could be that a trust score is basically a container of information. And if you have plenty of information from all areas of life, then of course you have a very good basis of judgment. You even have a kind of evidence for whether a person is trustworthy or not. But in the very core of the understanding of the concept of trust, you would say it's a kind of social advancement, so a kind of pro-social behavior without checking background, without collecting all information available about a specific person. If you think about trust in technical artifacts, for example, a car, you do not need to know how an engine works. You don't need to look up the engine before you start your car. You simply get in and you start and you drive with full trust in that everything will function. And this is a different type of trust than the trust that is based on information. I wanted to add a very tiny footnote to what Jakub said before, and also your little survey. It's interesting that there's a first survey on the Chinese and the social credit score, and there you find that 80% of the Chinese people think that that's a good system. So they are very positive about that. 18% say, neither nor. Just 2% think about that critical. So there's a huge, also culturally speaking, a huge difference to survey results which you would find here, where we have comparative data for that in Austria and also Germany. Just 20% of people can imagine something like a social credit score in their society.
Well, keeping in mind that maybe people were slightly fearing that indeed saying, actually, I do find it a crap system, might have an effect on your social credits. So we're not talking about pure democracy here in the Far East. We have another question coming in. How can we democratize this? Voting on the desired content of terms that we check without reading because we hardly have a choice. Democratizing something like that, democratize it. What do you make of that? First Jakub and maybe Steffen later on.
Well, I think we have several examples of democratizing surveillance also. So let's think about the whole Black Lives Matter movement now, which happened because we actually now see the things that are happening much more because everybody has a phone in their hands. So I think that's one aspect of democratization which one has to consider. That a lot of people said, yeah, before it happened as well. Now we just film it and everybody sees it. And so I think that you can argue is like rather a positive effect of this panopticon. Although of course also you might say it is maybe also, it has this negative effect, again, that people who start arguing, they just film each other and there's no interaction happening anymore without filming each other, and you cut the worst pieces of the other person together and put it online and so on.
It's a little bit like complaining about Bill Gates and putting microchips into vaccines and actually publicizing all this on Facebook, but using a Windows computer. Anyway, I think we have to come to an end, and I'd love to put one last question to the both of you. Please be brief, as we might overdraw a little bit. I mean, during this discussion about this quantified society, I did get indeed the impression of a quantified society is a little bit, pardon my French, a little bit of a dictator's wet dream. On the other hand, I'm quite sure that a quantified society or quantification in a society, especially in a transparent democratic society, does have its benefits as well. If maybe you, Steffen, might give us one or two quick examples where you say quantification does indeed have great benefits.
Yeah, it has indeed great benefits. I agree. And think about the health area. It's very difficult to set up a study on the effect of medicine if you have a large number of patients voluntarily putting their data into a database. Of course, you might find the traces of good and long and healthy life, which you could not find without that. And so mass data quantification can lead to very positive effects, in particular in the area of health, I think.
Thank you, Steffen. And Jakub, quantification, benefits, trust.
Yeah, I think that there's, Steffen mentioned it already, that there's like the quantification aspect and there's the control aspect. So what is being done with that data? And so quantification in itself, I mean, you could imagine that also when you measure your health in order to become more healthy. So if you have this app from an insurance company and it measures how much steps you do a day, this might be a great thing because you have this imagination of yourself, this idea that actually I'm doing sports, but once I measure it, I see, no, actually I'm not doing so much. And I think I don't drink so much, but once I measure it, I realize, yeah, actually my life is full of exceptions where I did so. And so it might lead that if I use this data myself, that I could actually improve my behavior in a way that I think is relevant. But the other aspect is, of course, who else can look at it? And there it gets more complicated.
Ladies and gentlemen, we did find out, and you knew it before, but you didn't hear it in this way before, there are always two sides to one coin. Many thanks, Steffen and Jakub, for joining us today. Thank you to Dr. Jakub Samochowiec from Gottlieb Duttweiler Institute and Professor Steffen Mau from Humboldt University of Berlin for making sense of numbers and quantification also in terms of trust. Our gratefulness will be unmeasurable. Before this webinar comes to an end, as usual, some quick info to you. As usual, there will be a little survey at the end of this day. You will get an email soon, and our hosts will be grateful if you could have a look into it. Of course, we do realize there were huge problems with sound. Once again, our deeply felt apologies for that. Technic aside is not always playing along. This is a quite new format. I do understand not everything can be running perfect right from the start. So sorry about that, but the recording of today's webinar will be put online, as I said earlier, on the event website to have a look again on it, and I'm quite sure there the sound and everything will be quite okay, will be perfect, so no worries there. And if you missed a part, maybe also because of kids starting to whine about lunch while you're in home office, no worries, it's all there for you. Today's webinar, I mean not a lunch. Well, stay tuned for next week. The third and last webinar of our series will be aired live and in color coming Tuesday, 10 a.m. Central European Summertime, so 1 hour earlier than the last two webinars on this channel, and probably less hungry kids at this time of the day, at least if you are in a European area settled. The third session being concerned with the way forward, preparing for an uncertain future through digitization and leadership. We're looking forward to welcoming you all again without sound troubles, of course. For now, many thanks for tuning in, many thanks for your participation, and many thanks for your questions. Stay healthy, stay curious. See you next Tuesday.